Each will control 20 minutes. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim the time in opposition to this measure.
Okay, does the gentleman from New York favor the motion?
Yes.
Okay, on that basis, pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida will control the 20 minutes in opposition.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material into the measure.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to grant 1/2 of my time to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and I ask unanimous consent that he be allowed to control those 10 minutes.
Without objection. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as the Nazis ravaged Europe, confiscation of property was just one of the many injustices Holocaust victims endured. In the almost 75 years since World War II ended, helping to repair the wrongs inflicted by the Nazis by restoring the property of millions of people who had their lives torn apart has proven a difficult, challenging problem. In 2009, Holocaust-era Assets Conference addressed the ongoing injustices created by the Holocaust, including guidance related to restitution of property wrongfully seized. However, among the 46 signers to this declaration, including the United States, there were vast disparities in the degree into which the laws and policies of each country fulfill the principles to compensate survivors. This act will help hold governments accountable that have fallen short of their commitment to these important principles. This bill requires the State Department to assess the laws and policies regarding the return or restitution for wrongfully seized Holocaust-era assets by countries that participated in the 2009 Holocaust-era Assets Conference, and states that in its sense of Congress, that the Secretary should continue to report to Congress on Holocaust-era assets. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of time. The gentlelady from Florida is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to do something that I never would have thought that I would do in my time in Congress. I'm here to stand in opposition to a bill that purports to seek justice for Holocaust survivors. And anyone who knows just the slightest bit about my tenure in Congress knows how hard I have worked over the years in support of Holocaust survivors. I've held hearings on the plight of survivors. I've introduced bills to seek justice for survivors. I've pressed Germany to honor its obligation and its commitment to survivors and ensure that Germany take care of the health and home care needs of all survivors so that they may live out their remaining days in the dignity and comfort that they deserve. I have fought against those who deny the Holocaust, and I have spent countless hours speaking with and visiting with the many survivors that I have now come to know as dear friends, listening to their stories, hearing them recall the atrocities that they somehow managed to live through, and then hearing how even today, more than 70 years later, they still face the injustices of humanity's darkest period. In fact, it was Speaker Ryan who named me as one of the congressional members on the Holocaust Museum Board just last year, and I'm truly honored and humbled to have been named to this position. So I think my history of support for Holocaust survivors and their families is well established and well known, which is why I cannot, in good conscience, stand here before you, Mr. Speaker, and before my colleagues, before the American people, and before the Holocaust survivors who are listening, to offer my support for this bill. And with all due respect for my colleagues and their good friends, because I know that their hearts are in the right place, this bill is not what it purports to be. That's the problem. Let's start with the name, Mr. Speaker. Justice for uncompensated survivors today. Where is the justice, Mr. Speaker? This bill is nothing more than a mere reporting requirement. It's got a fancy name. It's going to give us the feel-good that you're doing something for survivors, but it's just a reporting requirement. What do survivors gain from that? There is no actionable item in this bill. There's nothing to compel any government to do anything in this bill. There's simply no real action here. This is a claims conference justice. And by that I mean the claims conference wants to appear to be doing all that it can for survivors, but it is nothing more than that. It's a smokescreen, because we should not be fooled, Mr. Speaker. This bill has the full support of the claims conference precisely because it does the bare minimum. It keeps the tension away from the sad truth. What is the truth? That the claims conference has utterly failed our Holocaust survivors. There is no denying that the claims conference has a particularly checkered history. Its flawed process, its failure to support fully the Holocaust survivors' needs, its opposition to allowing survivors real justice, and of course, the embezzlement and fraud issues. There's no denying that this bill moves the needle not 1 inch closer to justice. It has a fancy name, but there is no justice. And just look at the time frame here, Mr. Speaker. The report is due in 18 months. And then what? And how many of the survivors will pass away before this report even gets issued? So I'm sorry to say, but the JUST Act just falls so far short of what survivors need today that I cannot stand before my friends and colleagues, and I cannot stand before my Holocaust survivors and offer a voice of support for this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this bill and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The man is recognized.
First, let me thank Senator Baldwin and Senator Rubio for their tireless efforts on behalf of Holocaust survivors and their heirs. I would also like to acknowledge the important work of my New York colleague, Congressman Joe Crowley, and Chris Smith, who introduced the House version of this legislation. The Justice for Uncompensated Survivors, or the JUST Act, would shine a light on any country in Europe stalling on the return of or restitution for wrongfully confiscated or transferred Holocaust-era assets. Nearly 75 years after the end of World War II, we are still debating property rights for Holocaust victims. That's truly astonishing. According to the Holocaust Immovable Property Restitution Study, a substantial amount of property confiscated from European Jews hasn't been returned to its rightful owners, or its owners haven't been compensated at all. We must ensure that the United States is holding governments to their obligations and endorsing that property is properly returned. Holocaust survivors have waited too long for justice. We cannot let them wait any longer. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Lady from Florida is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The lady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I previously discussed how passing just a reporting requirement is not justice for survivors, never mind the title. It may be vigilance, but there will be no justice served for a single survivor when this body passes this bill and sends it to the President for his signature. But, Mr. Speaker, there's something even worse than not providing justice for survivors, and that is depriving them of justice. And I want to talk about one of the principles in this bill that, while on the face of it, it might read like it's a simple principle, but perhaps it sounds good, common sense, and this is what it does. This bill directs the Secretary of State to submit a report to Congress that assesses and describes the nature and extent that certain countries have gone to in order to meet the goals and objectives of the 2009 Holocaust-era Assets Conference. Again, sounds reasonable, and it's always good to hold countries accountable, especially when we're talking about seeking justice for Holocaust survivors. But one of the big flaws of the 2009 conference, and what this bill does by asking the Secretary to report on how governments are complying with these goals is that it enshrines a principle of running out the clock on survivors. The principle, which is specifically highlighted in this bill, the JUST Act, is the notion that allowing governments to use the assets of heirless property claims to provide for other survivors' needs. Essentially, what this is saying to the governments that have claims against them or that have obligations to survivors that they must meet is, go ahead, stall as long as you can, wait them out, then use those assets to pay off your obligations. How long have survivors had to wait now, Mr. Speaker? Over 70 years. And the longer they wait, the longer those states which have obligations to survivors are allowed to stall, the less that these states will be on the hook for. Even worse, this rewards states for stalling. It compounds the injustice to survivors, using property and assets that were denied to survivors for over 7 decades to then pay off other survivors is sickening. Every survivor deserves justice, and that includes all who have lived through the unthinkable but are no longer with us today. This practice is nothing more than a smokescreen for Germany's and other claims conference failures to forthrightly provide for all survivors' needs. Let's think about it this way, Mr. Speaker. The Claims Conference will support the idea of using heirless claims to provide for other survivors. Sure. But will the Claims Conference support the idea that survivors still being denied their justice by the insurance companies should be allowed to sue those insurance companies in federal court? Nope. And I wonder why that is. If my colleagues want to support this bill, and if they think that using heirless property to pay for the needs of other survivors is the best we can get, then fine. But I challenge each and every one of you to believe that we can do more, we must do more, that we have a moral responsibility to do more for survivors. Surely, if we can tell governments in Europe that it's okay to benefit from their unwillingness to resolve the outstanding property claims against them for 70 years, then we can tell our survivors that it is okay for them to go to federal court and fight for their justice. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlewoman reserves. From Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from California, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, and I also ask unanimous consent that he control the remainder of that time.
Objection. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me thank the gentlelady from Florida, the chairman emeritus of our committee. Let me thank her for her tireless work advocating on behalf of Holocaust survivors. And let me say at the outset here that no one in Congress, no one in this Congress has done more to advocate on behalf of survivors than Eliana Ross-Lehtinen, and I believe that to be true through her entire tenure in this body. Let me also explain the thoughts as explained to us behind our Senate colleagues that put together the JUST Act. From their standpoint, from their vantage point, the JUST Act is a simple reporting requirement to assess the progress of signatories to the 2009 Terrorism Declaration on Holocaust-era assets and related issues. And the goal there, of course, was to fulfilling the principles in that declaration, and a lot of time and effort went into trying to leverage that, that agreement out of 46 countries that agreed to these principles. Now, here's the point. Here's where we have a difference of opinion. Of those 46 countries, some of them are falling short, woefully short of their commitments. Here's the conflict of visions. Some are saying, many are saying, look, we need to put pressure on them. The Senate unanimously came to the conclusion that a way to do that is with this bill, because what the legislation does is to ensure that there is an accountability mechanism of checking adherence to the Declaration principles, and to make sure that it doesn't fall by the wayside by bringing accountability to those countries that don't. The injustices of the Holocaust, frankly, here today, those injustices are too many to name. And many are unaddressed in that declaration, and I concur from that standpoint. But at the same time, we need to continue pushing to right the full spectrum of these wrongs, but before us we have a bill which will bring much leverage. We cannot lose the headway that we've made towards compensating survivors and families for what was rightfully theirs. Our partners have already agreed to the restitution principles in the Declaration, a formal report that shows who has fallen short and how, it is argued by our colleagues in the Senate, would be a powerful instrument for the U.S. government to push for changes. From my standpoint, I understand the arguments being made by the Senate. It does not mean that we should not go forward to make other points. But the argument they make to us is, let's give the State Department the tools it needs to ensure accountability. This is an argument that on both sides of the aisle, the preponderance of members here, I think, concur with. So with that said, I'm going to yield back. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California
Speaker,
reserves. Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier I spoke about survivors being unable to sue the insurance companies in federal court, how unjust that is. What a travesty. First, they were forced to suffer the inhumanity of the Nazis during the Holocaust, treated as outsiders. Worse than that, there really are just no words to adequately describe how Jews were treated during the Nazi time. And now, for so many, they continue to face injustices on a daily basis. You would think, Mr. Speaker, that those who endured and managed to make it here to America, home of freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, where everyone is meant to have equal rights, would not have to face the harsh truth that they are still being treated no better than second-class citizens. Imagine how survivors feel when they are told that in America, almost anyone can have their rightful day in court unless you're a Holocaust survivor with a claim against one of the big, rich, powerful insurance companies. In that case, you have no right to your justice. You have no day in court. You are prohibited from bringing justice to the courts. Countless survivors had valid insurance policies with insurance companies in Europe before the Holocaust. But when so many tried to make a claim on the policies of their loved ones, can you imagine what these companies told them? The insurance companies have asked Holocaust survivors to show their policies. Because as we all know, Mr. Speaker, the Nazis just let the Jews of Europe take all of their important documentation and their most cherished possessions with them before they were hauled off for extermination. Of course, that did not happen. Even worse, these big, rich, powerful insurance companies didn't just reject these claims due to the absence of policy documents. So many claims were rejected due to the absence of a death certificate, another paper that the insurance companies knew were not readily available. They did not pass them out in extermination camps. The relatives did not get a death certificate. But yet that's what insurance companies are asking of survivors. Of course, we all know that policyholders aren't the only ones with the proper documentation. Allianz or any of those big, rich, powerful insurance companies isn't just going to take my word for it that I have a policy with them. Insurance companies are going to have their own documentation to validate they claim. They have that documentation. But do insurance companies do this for survivors? Do they show them the claims? Of course not. And unfortunately, there's nothing to compel these huge, rich, and powerful insurance companies to provide it and to pay off those claims. These claims, by the way, Mr. Speaker, now run into the billions of dollars. So you can imagine why the insurance companies would fight so hard against allowing survivors to receive their claims. This is not justice. This is just as immoral and as reprehensible as you can get. And these rich and powerful insurance companies should be held liable, and they should be held accountable for these sins against morality and humanity. And that's the bill that we should be debating today. And that's why for years I've authored the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act, H.R. 762, in this Congress. And I have worked side by side with so many survivors over the years who feel as if they are continuing to be victimized. And they ask me, why can everyone else get their day in court, like we're all entitled to, but not Holocaust survivors? My bill is simple, Mr. Speaker. It will finally allow survivors the ability to bring their cases before the U.S. court system and allows them to have their day in court. It does not prejudge the outcome on any case. It simply says survivors can face the insurance companies in court and seek redress. It will make the insurance companies open up their books and let the world know the truth. And if it is decided by the U.S. court system that these insurance companies have in fact been shirking their moral and legal responsibilities, then the appropriate course of action should be taken. But this cannot happen. These survivors cannot have their day in court unless we take steps to ensure that it can. If we are here today to talk about justice for survivors, as this bill is called, let's talk about real action. Let's talk about doing something more than a simple reporting requirement with a fancy name. Let's talk about ending 7 decades of injustice. Let's talk about ending impunity for these big, powerful, rich insurance companies. Let's talk about accountability. Let's take up the JUST Act with the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act. Let's not allow ourselves to pass a reporting requirement and then pat ourselves on the back thinking the job is over. Let's get real justice for survivors. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's my pleasure now to yield 4 minutes to my fellow New Yorker, the gentleman from New York, who's the chair of the Democratic Caucus, Mr. Crowley, who is also the sponsor of the House version of this bill. 4 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I thank my friend and colleague, and I say friend from the Bronx, New York, Mr. Engel. He's been a true friend for many, many, many years. I thank him for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in full support today of S447, the Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Act. This important measure has already unanimously passed the Senate. Senator Tammy Baldwin has worked hard on this issue on a bipartisan basis, and I'm proud to have introduced the House version, as has been mentioned, along with my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. I appreciate the efforts of the chairman and the ranking member here in bringing the bill to the floor. I was first approached about the lack of justice still facing Holocaust survivors by a gentleman from Queens, New York, Yehuda Evron. I'm sorry that he cannot be here today to watch this debate, as he has spent a lifetime helping those who endured and escaped horrific atrocities during the Holocaust. Yehuda has been an incredible campaigner for Holocaust survivors, along with his wife, Leah, who lived in a ghetto under a false identification and joined others in hiding with resistance fighters. It was Yehuda and the World Jewish Restitution Organization who shared with me an ongoing indignity that Holocaust survivors still face to this very day. The inability to reclaim property unlawfully seized during the Holocaust. This is property that, if restored, could have a significant impact for the far too many Holocaust survivors living in poverty today. It may shock some to hear that here in the United States, 1/3 of the Holocaust survivors, 1/3, live at or under the poverty line. That's despicable. Some survivors are so poor they sometimes have to choose between food and medicine. Their stories put in stark relief the lifelong impact the Holocaust had on an entire generation of survivors and their families. That's why it's so important that in 2009, the United States, Israel, and 45 other countries signed the Terezin Declaration on Holocaust-era assets and related issues. In that important measure, countries pledged to take steps to return assets looted by the Nazi government and others. 9 years later, this is still work to be done. The JUST Act urges countries to keep their commitments to restitute wrongly taken Holocaust-era assets, and it will continue to shine a light on the ongoing struggle of Holocaust survivors to reclaim the property that is rightfully theirs. If you walk out the front door of this building and head down the street, you'll find yourself at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a powerful institution and one that reminds us not only of the heroic role played by the United States during World War II, but also the tremendous suffering faced by the Jewish people and all victims of the Holocaust. For me, it is also a reminder that if we can take steps to try to right more of the wrongs committed during the Holocaust, we should take the opportunity to do so, and I believe that this bill is an opportunity to do that. I have the utmost respect for the gentlelady from Florida, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Ross-Leighton. She knows of my affection for her. We've been friends for over 20 years. And I respect her opposition to this because I know that she does want justice for the victims. That is her goal. But for the record, I want to just include in the record that this bill is supported by the World Jewish Restitution Organization, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, Jewish Federations of North America, B'nai B'rith International, Hayas Refugee Assistance Organization, the National Coalition Supporting Eurasian Jewry, Union for Reform Judaism Religious Action Center, and the Orthodox Union. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's important to recognize those organizations that are in full support of this legislation, with all due respect to a woman I have tremendous respect for. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to close my part of this debate on the bill, I want to reiterate that though I strongly oppose the JUST Act because it's smoke and mirrors, it gives you the feel-good moment and provides no justice for survivors in spite of its fancy name, I do believe that my colleagues do have good intentions, and they want to see Holocaust survivors finally get the justice that has for so long evaded them. And their words and their remarks are heartfelt. They just don't apply to this bill. They would more rightly apply to the bill that I have, that I hope this body will soon take up. In fact, this body took action last Congress when the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act of 2016, or the HERE Act, was passed and signed into law. This was an important bill. It actually helped. And that bill allowed for civil claims or causes of action for the recovery of artwork stolen from Jews by the Nazis during the Holocaust. In other words, we have acted to ensure that Holocaust victims can bring claims in U.S. courts to recover their looted artwork and other possessions. So they can have their day in court, and I'm glad for it. If you lost a famous painting and there have been movies and books written about them, you can have your day in court. That's wonderful. But since HERE was passed, the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act, HERE, it has already been cited in several cases and has been applied by the Ninth Circuit Court to revive a previously dismissed Nazi-era art case. It's great. So why not take action to allow the same process to take place for survivors to hold insurance companies accountable? So if you had your artwork looted by the Nazis, you can have your day in court. But if the Nazis have destroyed your life and you had an insurance company policy, you do not have the right to take that case to court. It doesn't make sense. So, Mr. Speaker, we're here today to debate justice for uncompensated survivors of the Holocaust. A simple reporting requirement isn't going to do that. We shouldn't have to be taking such action, unfortunately, but because certain governments haven't lived up to their obligations and because these insurance companies and others complicit in Nazi-era crimes still manage to evade accountability, we have a moral obligation to step into action. And that's the message that I am giving to my colleagues. If we want to pass the JUST Act, so be it. But let's also vow here and now to take more concrete action to really give justice for Holocaust survivors. Let's take that next big step. Time is running out. Time is running out for all of these survivors, and we need action yesterday. Not today, but today will do. So I'm asking my colleagues to do the right thing, and I'm asking for this body, Mr. Speaker, to bring the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act to the floor as soon as possible so that we can take a meaningful step, a concrete step, an action item toward justice for survivors. And then all of those lofty words that are laid upon the table on this bill that don't really apply would really apply to this bill, the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act. We owe it to the survivors. We owe it to their families. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields. Recognize the gentleman from California. Gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 2.5 minutes to a gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, who is a very well-respected member of our Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, Ranking Member Engel, for his hard work on this bill and for yielding, and I thank Chairman Royce as well. I want to thank the many members of Congress who have shown their unyielding commitment to caring for Holocaust survivors and ensuring that their needs are met, including the co-sponsors of this bill, and of course to the House bill sponsor, Congressman Crowley and Congressman Smith. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my friend and colleague, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, for her tireless efforts throughout her career on behalf of Holocaust survivors in our own community in South Florida and everywhere they live. 2 weeks ago, after we marked Yom HaShoah, it is fitting that Congress would consider this bill. And I hope that the world is watching, because every year that we move away from the horrible atrocities of the Holocaust, we lose more and more survivors. The people who survived Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other Nazi death camps, people who survived the attempted genocide against them, where 6 million Jews perished. We must remember that every single victim, those who perished and those who survived, had a story. They had homes, they had businesses, family heirlooms and personal possessions, and as the Nazis stormed through Europe to wipe out European Jewry, they stole everything they could as they sent Jews to their deaths. And while no amount of money will ever erase these horrors, these survivors, their families, and their heirs deserve compensation for confiscated property, including Jewish communal, private, and heirless property. In 2009, the United States joined 46 other countries and agreed to the Terrorism Declaration on Holocaust-era assets. This was a commitment by these countries to provide for the restitution of confiscated property, but 9 years later, many European countries have still failed to meet their commitments in this agreement. Some countries still haven't passed legislation to create a system for private property restitution, and we should call out their failures. But as we speak, thousands of survivors are in need of immediate and urgent care and assistance. I am proud to represent a large community of survivors, and I see their critical needs going unmet day after day. This bill can be a tool to help us understand where the gaps lie in restitution programs, but it does not address, nor is it meant to address, the urgent need of survivors now. As they age, their needs grow. It's essential they receive the care they deserve. We must do everything to ensure that those needs are addressed. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. From California is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve the right to close, Mr. Speaker. Unless there are
from New
no
York
further,
is recognized.
If there are no further speakers.
Close, if that's appropriate.
Gentleman is recognized from New York to close.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
This legislation is critical to ensuring that Holocaust survivors and their heirs are compensated. Restitution and return will represent another step moving past this heinous chapter of human history. I want to thank my colleague and good friend, Chairman Ross Leighton, for her powerful remarks this afternoon and for her leadership for so many years in fighting for Holocaust survivors. I've met many of her constituents and many of my own who remain engaged in this prolonged battle for justice. I am a co-sponsor of Congresswoman Ross Leighton's legislation, and I proudly support her in these efforts, and I do hope that her bill will come to the floor as well. I also support this bill, Congressman Crowley and Smith, as well as Senators Baldwin and Rubio, in the effort to ensure that property is restituted and returned through the JUST Act. This legislation has already passed the Senate, so when we pass it here, it'll go right to the President's desk for signing. With this vote, we can push it across the finish line. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. From California is recognized.
I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have been contacted on behalf of the JUST Act by a number of organizations in support of the Senate bill. The major American Jewish organizations supporting this measure are the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish Federations of North America, the B'nai B'rith, Highest Refugee Assistance Organization, Union for Reform Judaism, Orthodox Union, World Jewish Restitution Organization, and others have argued that the Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Act, or JUST Act as the Senate calls it, is a measure that will have an outsized impact in encouraging countries to continue working to make amends for the evils of the Holocaust. That's what drove the Senate to pass this bill. Now, just to go into the details again a little bit, it was in 2009 that representatives of this country and 40 other countries agreed to a set of principles to address the welfare of survivors, to address Holocaust education, and to address issues related to restitution for seized property, among other issues. Now, that's what these 40 nations committed to. So 10 years have passed approximately, and it's time that we take stock of the work underway, because while a number of these partner countries have made great strides to uphold their commitments under the agreement, you and I know, everybody here knows, that some countries have fallen short. And this legislation, which charges the State Department with the responsibility for this important report, and let's call it naming and shaming, that's basically what is intended here, it gives the United States another tool to seek justice for Holocaust survivors, to seek justice for their families of Holocaust victims. And it is our hope that passing this bill will motivate improvements even before the report is penned. Already we've seen some of these countries overseas renew their engagement on this issue, and that's the leverage that we want to deploy. You know, it is a devastating issue to even begin a discussion because we can never compensate Holocaust survivors truly for the unbelievable horror and devastation that they suffered. But from the perspective of most of the organizations that have talked to us about the bill, their point would be we can try to restore what is rightfully theirs, and part of the trying from their standpoint is to shed light on the efforts or lack thereof that other countries are making, and this bill does that. It unanimously passed the Senate for that reason. And I yield back the balance of my time and thank all of the members here who participated today in the debate over this very difficult issue.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 447? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The clerk will report the title.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4744 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4744, a bill to impose additional sanctions with respect to serious human rights abuses of the government of Iran and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material on this measure. Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to place into the record exchanges of letters with other committees of jurisdiction.
Objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in January, this body came together. It was a near unanimous vote to support the Iranian people who were engaged in legitimate protests against a very oppressive regime. I want to thank Mr. Mike McCall here, Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and Mr. Elliot Engel, the ranking member of our Committee on Foreign Affairs, for their engagement in this issue. And at the time, we were witnessing tens of thousands of Iranians who had taken to the streets in the largest demonstration that we had seen since the Green Revolution of 2009. The protests aimed at economic stagnation, aimed at widespread corruption, and people were talking about that all the time, aimed at the Revolutionary Guard Corps control over that economy because they had nationalized, seized so much of that economy. And quickly we saw that spread across Iran as Persians sought to exercise the fundamental right of freedom of expression, as people across that country of every ethnicity and every religion began to speak out. Many demonstrators shouted slogans aimed at Iran's costly support for Syria's Bashar al-Assad, if you recall from reading the press accounts. And they argued about the cost, the support that went to the terrorist groups such as Hezbollah. Predictably, the Iranian regime moved swiftly to quash the demonstrations and throttle social media. More than 1,000 Iranians were jailed, dozens were killed. House Resolution 676 condemned this brutal violence back in January, called for targeted sanctions to hold the regime to account. But today we act to make good on that call. because the bill before us today, Chairman McCall's H.R. 4744, requires the administration to determine whether senior Iranian officials should be sanctioned for human rights abuses. And it also requires determinations on whether Iranian businesses should be sanctioned for public corruption with respect to those that are involved in corruption. And it mandates sanctions on those officials responsible for Iran's wrongful, politically motivated jailing of U.S. citizens. Mr. Speaker, for years the regime in Tehran has systematically beat down all opposition inside Iran. It regularly uses brutal tactics back in Iran, including torture and mass executions, as it seeks to export violence and radical ideology abroad as well. I think all of us can think back to that 1979 revolution and contemplate how much better Iran would have been had it not went off onto a path of becoming a rogue state. As this legislation details, today the regime flagrantly disregards commitments it's made to respect the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. Many of us recall the barbaric mass executions carried out over a 4-month period in 1988. And I dare say, if you know any Persians, if you know people who escaped from Iran, you know that during that period of time leading up to 1988, there were over 30,000 students and young professionals who lost their lives as a consequence. We know that the political prisoners there went through a grueling experience. In Evin prison and other prisons, many were executed by hanging, many by firing squad. They refused to renounce their political affiliations, and that was the fate that was handed out to them. And today, the regime still persecutes ethnic and religious minority groups, such as the Baha'i, Christians, of course, Sufi, Sunni, dissenting Shia Muslims. And we all remember the way the Ayatollah brutally suppressed the peaceful political dissent during the Green Revolution, during which the previous administration remained embarrassingly silent, in my view, and many of us here on this floor today spoke up often at that time about that dissent during the Green Revolution, because I think this was a real opportunity missed by the United States. So, again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman McCall and I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for their leadership on this legislation. I am glad we have strong bipartisan support for this measure. Regardless of how one views the Iran nuclear agreement, it is critical that the United States and our allies continue to press Iran for its dangerous and threatening acts that fall outside of the JCPOA. And this is an area where officials from both the Trump and Obama administrations agree, and they agree for good reason here. Remember, this is the same regime that is holding American citizens, including one who is in very poor health, holding them on sham charges in one of the largest ransom schemes, from my standpoint, that was ever devised. This regime, of course, held its first American hostages in 1979 when it overran our U.S. Embassy. The regime's M.O. remains the same. It is far past time the regime faced consequences for its attacks on Iranians and for its attacks on Americans alike. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this measure and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by thanking Congressmen Deutsch and McCall, both valued members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for their hard work on this bill. I want to also thank our Chairman Ed Royce, who has been a strong bipartisan voice in things that are so important to the country, our country, and to the world. And we always say that We take pride in having the Foreign Affairs Committee being the most bipartisan committee in the entire Congress. Iran has isolated itself on the global stage because it refuses to abandon a range of aggressive activities that pose a threat to the region and a threat to the entire international community. On that list is the regime's terrible mistreatment of its own people, and its heinous practice of prolonged and politically motivated detentions of American citizens. The bill before us now seeks to put an end to these intolerable practices. It would place sanctions on anyone responsible for politically motivated harassment, abuse, extortion, or extended detention or trial of Americans or Iranians. Earlier this year, we stood on this floor in solidarity with protesters in Iran who sought a better future for their country and for the next generation. They wanted to see their government abandon its support for Iranian proxy forces and terrorist groups like Hezbollah in favor of funding health care and employment opportunities for average Iranians. This is a country that has suffered so much under the Ayatollahs and the economic mismanagement of its leaders. And the protests in December and January were a stark reminder of the regime's tight grip on power, as many protesters were killed in the streets and blocked from communicating with the outside world. Today, as we pass this legislation, we think about the Americans who currently sit in Iranian prisons. We think about Robert Levinson, Mr. Deutsch's constituent, who has been missing for over 11 years, who has missed the weddings of his children and the births of his grandchildren. The Iranian regime had promised to cooperate with the investigation to locate Mr. Levinson, but to that date, that cooperation has been virtually non-existent. There is no real clarity in U.S. policy toward Iran. The United States faces a looming deadline on the nuclear deal, and the future remains uncertain. But there is one thing we can all agree. We cannot let up the pressure on Iran for its human rights violations, particularly against American citizens. So again, I want to thank Mr. McCall and Mr. Deutsch for doing a great job with this. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation. If you care about the injustices going on in Iran, then it's important to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security and the author of this bill.
Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge support for my bill to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its continued human rights violations. I introduced the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act with Congressman Deutsch, and I'm grateful for Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel's support in this effort. The Iranian regime continues to perpetrate gross human rights abuses against its own people. They continue to suppress and censor their people's calls for democratic reform. They recklessly use their nation's resources to expand their destabilizing influence and support of terrorism. And they continue to engage in corrupt practices. And they continue to illegally detain and imprison our citizens without just cause. This is simply unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, this bill serves as a clear signal to the people of Iran that we support their quest for freedom. It shines a light on the regime's human rights violations and targets Iranian officials guilty of corruption, censorship, and the diversion of goods intended for the Iranian people. It requires the President to work with our international partners to develop a strategy to end this inhumane behavior and sanctions those officials complicit in those crimes. And finally, it sanctions those individuals who take Americans hostage. Mr. Speaker, today there are more than 6 American citizens and permanent U.S. residents held by the Iranian regime in a shameful attempt to use innocent human lives as political bargaining chips. These hostages include Bob Levinson, Congressman Deutsch's constituent, who has been missing since 2007 and remains America's longest held hostage. Siamak Namazi and his 81-year-old father, Bakr, held since 2015 and 16, respectively. PhD student Jie Wang, held since 2016, and internet freedom activist Nizar Zaka, held since 2016, and others. The United States has a moral responsibility to devote resources to these hostages and make their return a priority. I sent a letter with Congressman Liu and 46 other members of Congress requesting that the administration keep Congress informed as to what steps they are taking to guarantee this happens. So again, I want to thank the chairman, ranking member, Congressman Deutsch, for their leadership in this bipartisan effort to hold Iran accountable. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman of California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to a gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel and Chairman Royce, for your support of this legislation. And special thanks to my colleague, Chairman McCall, for your leadership in recognizing the need to take action. We must work together to stop the brutal Iranian regime's human rights abuses and demand the release of American hostages that Iran is using as pawns for political leverage. I'm proud to partner with you, Mr. McCall, in this effort. The Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act sends a clear message to the Iranian regime and to the rest of the world. This Congress, this country will not tolerate the flagrant disregard of the most basic of human rights. My colleagues have explained the merits of this bill, and I know it is difficult for many Americans to imagine. But we are here today to show our resolve in the face of really unbelievable circumstances. For my constituents, the family of Robert Levinson, this is a nightmare that they have lived for 11 years. Bob Levinson is the longest-held American hostage in history. He disappeared in Iran on March 9th, 2007. Imagine 11 years without your husband or your father. Imagine having grandchildren who have never had the chance to meet their grandfather. Imagine 11 anniversaries, dozens of family birthdays and holidays that passed by without Bob, just an empty place where Bob should be sitting. Bob's wife, Christine, and his 7 children, Susan, Stephanie, Sarah, Dan, David, Samantha, and Doug, have been tireless advocates for their father. They've traveled to Iran themselves looking for answers. They have made the trip to Washington, D.C. countless times to meet with government officials, members of Congress. They have fought for action all the way to the Oval Office, directly appealing to President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. They have watched as others have returned home to their families. They have listened with hope as Iran's leaders have promised cooperation. And they have been disappointed more times than they can count as promises go unfulfilled year after year after year. Iran has become adept at this cruel game because that is what it is to this rogue Iranian regime. They say that hostages are not hostages, but these people are not detained under a legal order. They have lost their freedom. They have been separated from their families, and they have been held under the shamelessly trumped up and false charges. Any attempt to show due process or trials has been a sham. To the Levinsons, to the Namazi family, the Zaka family, the Wang family, and the other families whose loved ones are being held, we stand with you. Today, we speak clearly and loudly with one bipartisan voice to send the message that no country, no rogue regime will use American lives as leverage to further a dangerous agenda. This bill isn't about the nuclear deal. Nothing in this bill precludes our continued participation in the JCPOA, but this bill makes clear the importance of closely coordinating with our allies and partners whose citizens have also been held hostage by Iran to apply pressure on the regime. If we're going to counter Iran's abuses, Iran's terrorism, Iran's threats to our troops and our national security interests, we must work in tandem with our partners around the globe. We will stand together against repression and the violation of human rights. We will stand together against religious persecution. We will stand together for the rule of law and democratic values. And taking hostages and violating the most fundamental values that cut to the core of our dignity as human beings is unacceptable to this Congress and to members of the international community. I urge all of my colleagues to stand up to Iran's rogue regime, to stand up for human rights and for the people of Iran, to stand with the Levinsons and the other families whose loved ones are missing from their lives, and to fight for their return home by supporting this bill. Please support H.R. 4744, and together we will stand for basic human rights. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Eliana Ross-Layton, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa.
Gentleman from Florida. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Chairman Royce for his kindness and his leadership, and Ranking Member Elliott, my favorite mensch, for bringing this bill to the floor today. And I also want to thank and congratulate Michael McCall and my South Florida colleague and dear friend Ted Deutsch for their work in authoring this important bill. The regime in Iran, as we have heard from my colleagues, is responsible for some of the most despicable human rights abuses imaginable. The regime is also notorious for its hostage-taking tactics, hoping to get financial or political concessions from the United States and other Western countries for their hostage-taking. Mr. Deutsch and I have been highlighting these abuses in our subcommittee through multiple hearings, many pieces of legislation, including a resolution that the House passed last year, House Resolution 317, that urged the President to make the release of Americans held hostage in Iran the highest of priorities. We also held a hearing on some of the hostages named in the resolution, where we heard from family members of Mr. Deutsch's constituent, Bob Levinson, who is America's longest held hostage ever, Bakr and Siamak Namazi, father and son, who have been unjustly detained in Iran for far too long, Nizar Zaka. All of these families have had to endure so much, Mr. Speaker. Almost 1 year later, after our resolution, all of these men, as well as at least 4 other Americans, additional Americans, continue to be unjustly detained in Iran, suffering under horrific conditions with little to no contact with their families. Iran must be held accountable, Mr. Speaker. We need to be applying maximum pressure against the regime, and this bill gives the administration more tools to sanction the regime for this practice of taking hostages, and I offer my full support. I thank our esteemed chairman of our committee, as well as my friend, the ranking member. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.